Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago has highlighted climate change as a factor that could negatively impact the economy in the coming years. He says the South African Reserve Bank will now incorporate climate change into its scenario planning. Now, it appears that this issue is finally getting the recognition it deserves in the country, especially with the recent signing of the Climate Change Act by the President. For more on this, we're joined now by Brandon Abdinor, who is the program head of pollution and climate change at the Center for Environmental Rights. Brandon, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with your reaction to the governor's statement, and that is that they are now going to include climate change in their scenario planning. Does this signal that South Africa is taking climate change very seriously?
Good evening, Pauline. Good evening to the viewers. Thanks for having me on. Yes, it's good to hear that statements like this are being made. I think we are seeing ever-increasing signals from government that this is being taken seriously, and that's been progressive over time. We're certainly seeing stronger and stronger statements being made. When the floods in eThekwini in 2022 happened, we saw the president come out with very strong messaging around climate change. And we're also seeing that backed up with certain actions. The Climate Change Act that you mentioned is obviously one of them. The fact that we're engaging with overseas climate funders, which have with them conditions around decarbonization, also signals an increasing commitment. But then we're also seeing actions that sort of go in a different direction. I mean, we're seeing a fixation with potential gas to power projects. We're seeing climate harming projects still being approved. So we still have a way to go, I would say. Yeah,
and you mentioned those. We'll talk about Sasol in a moment. Do we understand enough, though, Brandon, just how much climate change can impact the economy and, most importantly, how?
I think we can understand the extent of it to some extent. I don't think it's been quantified entirely, but we know what the risks look like. And we get two types of climate risks. So the first one is transition risk. Because the world and society and the economy of the world is responding to climate change, it brings certain changes into being. For example, the European Union has what it's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which effectively taxes the carbon footprint of imports. So that's an example of the kind of transition risk that could happen, as well as increasing regulation and litigation risk. More and more companies and governments are being taken to court for inadequate climate action. And then we have the physical risk. We know what sort of impacts are here and are coming, such as floods, wildfires, droughts, and so on. Damage to infrastructure. If we consider that sea level rise is going to continue actually for thousands of years, no matter how well we respond, and we think of the damage that could cause to coastal infrastructure, it's potentially devastating. And I think the true value of those impacts have yet to be calculated.
Yeah, you use that very important word, risk. How do we mitigate the risk?
Well, the first one is to mitigate climate change. So we need to slow down the global warming that's happening. And the only way to do that is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we really need to move away from burning fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And another leg of that is ecosystem restoration. If we have healthy ecosystems that can store carbon in the soil, that can help manage our water resources and so on, that is a way of mitigating that risk.
Yeah, moving away from fossil fuels is something that I suspect is going to be done at a particular pace and keeping in mind the impact it's likely to have on the ordinary lives of people when it comes to their finances. Let's talk about the South African Reserve Bank and whether it is getting ahead of corporate South Africa, Brandon. And I'm saying this with the example of Sasol, which was given a deviation allowance regarding its emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's worth noting that the SASL exemption relates to its toxic air pollution as opposed to its greenhouse gas emissions. So same source, but different problem, although interrelated. It's really hard to say whether the state is getting sort of ahead of corporate South Africa. I mean, corporate South Africa encompasses many different entities. We know that carbon-intensive industries and businesses obviously rely on the burning of fossil fuels and those greenhouse gas emissions effectively to be able to make money in the way that they do. And one can understand resistance. It's sometimes technologically not easy, although sometimes it's easier, and it's obviously quite expensive as well. But corporate South Africa is big. So there are many businesses that are embracing the decarbonization journey. And in fact, the opportunity for new businesses that are grounded in that to come up. For example, we have the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, which looks at how we could industrialize around the renewable energy value chain, which can then create jobs to balance those that will be lost in the move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah. Let's talk about South Africa not transitioning in time. What could the risks be?
Well, again, from a transitional risk point of view, we could effectively become like a climate pariah, whereby something that amounts to sanctions eventually get levied, or our exports become uncompetitive because they're being taxed. The EU has brought this measure in, but other countries are considering the same. But really, the big one is the physical risk. So we're talking about loss of life. We're talking about extreme damage. We're talking about infrastructure being wiped out. If we look at the costs just of the Durban floods, that alone was estimated between 17 and 40 billion. So really the way we live and considering that we are a water scarce country, the risks to our available drinking water are enormous. And then food production is next in line. And you can imagine, aside from the severe weather events and those sort of physical phenomena, what that does to the fabric of society. And we can expect to see climate migration, we can expect to see civil unrest. So it's not an exaggeration to say that everything could fall apart if we do not act quickly enough.
Yeah. We now have the newly signed Climate Change Act. Does that give us comfort that the South African government is indeed taking this seriously, and might that be part of the mitigation factor?
It could be. The most uncomfortable fact around that at the moment is that that act is not in fact operationalized. So it's been signed by the president, but it comes into operation at a date that the president will still proclaim in the government gazette. So we are waiting anxiously for that to happen, because until it does, many of the important mechanisms in that act don't come into operation, as it were. But it is a reasonably good piece of legislation. It does lay out the tools that we need for climate change mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it very much lays out the tools for adaptation. So roping in national government, provincial, local government, different sectors, putting those measures into place to deal with the impacts that we know are coming and to create a more climate resilient society and economy.
Yeah. Finally, Brandon, Eskom. It's probably one of the sectors that emits the most amount of greenhouse gases. Where are things there? Do you think that it is going to be able to transition in time? Because there are lots of people employed by Eskom, and if these coal-fired power stations are shut down immediately, that obviously has an economic impact on the people. But talk to us about Eskom. Are they on the right track, or are they South Africa's biggest risk?
Well, I don't think they're far enough down the track. We know that for the historical legacy is that we're reliant on coal-fired power for electricity. So the move away from that needs to happen as quickly as is possible. And we know that can't be done overnight. So it's a question of decommissioning those plants as quickly as possible. We know that renewable energy is quicker to build, it's cheaper, it's more reliable. And once it's up, you don't have those fuel costs. So one needs to see the political will, and it's not only at Eskom, it's also at central energy planning bodies to move in that direction. And very importantly, many will suggest that we need to transition to renewables from coal via natural gas, and that's absolutely not true. Natural gas is in fact as harmful for the climate as coal. It's cleaner when you burn it, so it doesn't have the same air pollution issues. But to lock ourselves into a new fossil fuel system that relies on a fuel that we would need to import at global prices is not only a bad idea from a climate and environmental and social perspective, but is going to mean that electricity is going to become ever more expensive. Yeah. Which obviously then exacerbates some of our existing structural challenges.
Brandon Abdinor, thank you very much for your time.